Forms in Dynamics 365 are generally the main point of interaction for users when they start working with the application. Since this is how most of your users are going to interact with the application regularly, it's really important that each form is designed in a way that's going to be very easy for the user to use and is designed for maximum effectiveness based upon whatever that user is trying to accomplish. One of the problems you can run into with forms is if you poorly design your forms, it can have a huge impact on not only performance, but even user adoption. If I don't find a form easy to use, I'm not going to use it. I'm just going to steer clear of it. So one of the things that we want to do in this module is really look at how forms will help you establish good principles inside the application. And if you can establish good design practices right away, you can now allow your users, and your users will just naturally start to use the forms more and more. So in this module, we're going to talk just a little bit about, what are the different types of Dynamics 365 forms that are available? How do you go in and customize them? What are some of the different ways to position tabs, and what are the different components that are involved in there? What are some of the specialized items that you can do, such as subgrids, and how those subgrids could be used to do things like record sharing, and how editable grids play into the mix on what you're doing, and how you might be able to do things with image files and really set these informations up and these forms up so people can use them more effectively. We're going to show you how to use access teams and subgrids to facilitate record sharing within the application so it's easier for users to share out records within that scenario. And then we're also going to show you how to do things like multiple forms. So one of the things that sometimes comes into play when you're working through it is having multiple forms in place. So based upon who individual people are, you could actually target forms based upon their role and make the information that they're seeing on those forms much more useful based upon who they are. Dynamics 365 has several different forms that can be used inside the application depending upon what it is that you're trying to accomplish. So what we can see here is we have a few of the different types of forms that are available. So the first one is the main form, and this is the one that you're going to see probably more often than not. This is the one that's going to be used by the browser. This is the one that will also be used by the Outlook client as well as any Dynamics 365 mobile client. So any changes or customizations that you make to a main form within the application really will transfer over into multiple experiences, which is really nice from that whole kind of build once, deploy in multiple scenarios mantra that we use from a Dynamics 365 perspective. Now, the other ones that you'll see in here are things like the quick create form. And so sometimes you just very simply want to create a record where you don't necessarily need to have all the fields filled out in there. So the quick create is really just a shortened version of the form that only has a couple of the key fields that you need to initially get that record created. Once that record is created, then you could open it up at a later time and fill in any of the additional information that you're working with. And then they also have what's called a quick view form. And this is a really nice scenario to allow you to view parent record information in other forms. So traditionally, if you have like a parent account, the only thing that you really could do is click on the link for the parent account record and open it up in the application. Now with quick view forms, you actually have the capabilities to display a quick view form that would have the parent account information as well as maybe like a phone number and some subgrids to really make that information easier to work with inside the application. Now there's a lot of different uses for each one of these form types, like the main form also transfers over into Interactive Service Hub and some of those things, but in essence, from a contextual standpoint, these are really the three main form types that you're going to use. You might just use different versions of these form types to facilitate different application functionality. When you go in and you actually start designing your form, it's important to note that the form is really broken down into four sections. So the first section that you can kind of see here on the screenshot is the header. The header is really only going to be used for important fields. So if you think about it in terms of like the account entity, you're going to use things like maybe credit limit, status, owner, things that you really want to have front and center, but you're not necessarily going to need on the body of the form. The nice thing about the header is you do have the capabilities to actually edit the fields that are in that header. So things like I said, credit limit, those kind of things, you typically would put in a header just because those you do want to potentially edit from time to time, but it's also nice to have those front and center. Down at the bottom, you'll see that there's actually a footer. Now, the footer is a little different from the header in the fact that the footer fields are only going to be read-only. So typically, you're only going to put stuff in the footer that you really want to just have available, but you're not necessarily going to have people interact with. Obviously, the body of the form is where most of what you're going to be doing from a form design perspective is going to take place. This is where we're going to start adding our tabs. This is where we're going to add our sections and our fields. If we have things like subgrids and web resources and some of those things that we want to really bring front and center to people on the body of the form, that's where you're going to do the primary interaction from an application standpoint. And then over on kind of the left-hand side of the screen is where you're going to see the navigation. So this is where if you have relationships with other entities, this is where if you have maybe external applications you want to interface with on that main form, this is where you can actually work through and add those kind of customized relationships and components. Now let's just talk a little bit about that from an application standpoint. You'll see that on the actual navigation itself, when you're working with it from a design perspective, everything is kind of listed from top to bottom with the different groups being displayed. So I can see here that I have common and sales and service and marketing. From an actual application standpoint, what's important to note is it's going to display from left to right. So when you actually drill down into the related items in the application, you won't see them from top to bottom. It'll still honor the groupings, it'll still have that information in there, but you'll see it more from a left to right type of situation. This is where you're gonna, like I said, have basically relationships or links to other entities that are related to this option. You can drag and drop things around to change the order. The one thing that you'll notice is the groups themselves. The groups are kind of static. So the common, sales, service, marketing, that you can't necessarily change those groups. However, if you move things around inside there and a group does not necessarily have anything in there, for example, like you'll see marketing is empty, it's not going to display on the form. However, even though it's not going to display on the form, if I did want it to show up, I couldn't change the name from marketing to something else. That's typically going to just correspond with some of the group names that you have on your individual records themselves. Now, on the form itself, when you start adding and moving with different components, you're going to see that it's broken down into tabs, sections, and fields. So from a tab perspective, that's really where you're going to be able to collapse and expand stuff as necessary, really to give you kind of that primary grouping for those individual situations. From a tab standpoint, you can typically have between 1 and 3 column tabs on the form itself. Each tab column will have individual sections that will be associated with it. So whenever you add a tab, regardless of how many columns that tab has in it, it will default in with at least one section because you have to have a section on that tab in order for you to add fields to it. Then the sections, you can have between 1 and 4 column sections inside a given tab column. Now, I'll show you this when we get into the demo a little bit as well. This is where you do have to be a little bit careful from a real estate standpoint. If you start to go in with too many columns and too many sections that have too many columns in them, things can get overwhelming pretty quick. But the sections is where you're actually going to go in and start adding your fields and your lists and your charts, as well as like, Bing Maps, any of those types of things. And you will basically go in and add your sections and your tabs through the insert ribbon. And again, we'll show you that when we get into the demo here in just a couple of seconds. And then all the way over on the right-hand side of the form, you'll see your Field Explorer. Your Field Explorer is going to show you all the fields that are associated with this particular entity that you would want to add onto this form. Now, what's nice about the Field Explorer is it allows you to filter to see only custom fields. So if you've added some custom fields to that entity and you want to use those, you can have it filter just for the custom fields, or you can have it show all the fields that are available for that specific entity. By default, it is only going to show the unused fields. So you'll see that on here on the Field Explorer, there's a checkbox here. This will only show you unused fields. If for some reason you wanted a field to be added to the form twice, maybe once in the header and then once in the body, you certainly could do that. You do have the capabilities if you want to either drag the field and then just position it on the form where you want, or you can just double click the field from Field Explorer and that will automatically add it into that section as you're moving forward. The other thing that's nice is if you're in here and you're editing specific fields and you're working through things and you realize, you know what, I really should have one more or field on this form, there's a new field button down at the bottom. And if you click on that new field button, that'll actually create a new field right there for you. It'll show up in Field Explorer, and then you can turn around and add it to the form. So let's hop back in and just kind of start playing with some forms a little bit. So I'm back in my loan management solution that we created earlier, and I'm going to go ahead and just expand the loan application item to see all the different forms. And when I click on forms, this will go ahead and load all the forms that were kind of auto-created for this entity when we went ahead and created it. So you can see that I have kind of my main form, I have my mobile kind of express form, and then I have my quick view form. Mobile Express, that was for if you were using kind of the older version of Mobile Express for Dynamics 365, which really doesn't get used that much anymore. So you wouldn't really have to worry much about the Mobile Express form. Really the main ones that you're going to focus on are the main and the Quick View form, as well as the Quick Create form. Now you'll notice we don't have the Quick Create form here yet. I'll show you how you turn that on for a specific entity here in just a little bit, so you can kind of work through that. But let's go ahead and open up this informational form. And I'm just going to maximize this to kind of fill up the whole screen here. So when an entity is created, the forms are automatically created as well. Now you'll notice there's not a lot of information in here because there wasn't a lot of information available at the time when that form was created. So don't worry so much about the fact that things are in here and not necessarily overly displayed. That's something that we can absolutely kind of tweak down the road as we need to. Now you'll see up here in the insert or in the ribbon that I have the ability to kind of navigate through the different areas of my form. So here is that header that we kind of talked about earlier. If I select header here, this will now move this blue box up into the header area, where if I had specific fields that I wanted to add to the header, I could actually add those items directly into the header from here. And as I move through, you'll notice that owner shows up in here because owner is not currently added to that particular header. And that's important to note, is when it says it's showing you only unused fields, it's showing you unused fields in regards to that specific area or section that you're working with inside the form. So this is where if I wanted to add specific fields to the header just to bring them kind of to the forefront, I certainly could. So I'll do things like maybe add loan type and owner. Now, if I wanted to switch over into the navigation, this is where I could switch over to navigation, and this will light up kind of this area over here. And so this is where if I had relationships with other entities or other items that I wanted to bring to the forefront, this is where I would see what those specific relationships are, and this is where I could now move them over into these sections. Now, because I don't necessarily have anything in sales, service, or marketing, once I'm ready to kind of move forward with this, then that information will not show up because I don't have anything to show there. So this is where you can just kind of navigate through the individual areas kind of as needed. Now, we talked about this concept of tabs and sections and fields. So you'll notice here that I have a general section. This is what is going to allow people to kind of very quickly navigate to different parts of the form. And if I go into the general section, I see that it's kind of got the blue outline around it. That's telling me that this is the active object on this form. And so if I come up into here and I click on change properties, this is going to show me the properties for this specific tab on this form itself. So this is where I can see kind of the name that is assigned to it based upon when it was created. This is where I can see the label that's being presented on it. And this is where I can also determine whether or not I want to see the label on the form. And then also if it's expanded by default. So sometimes you might, through client-side scripting or something to that nature, you might actually choose to not have some of these tabs expanded by default. And then you might use business rules and stuff to expand things based upon different items. That's really what this is going to allow you to do. Now you'll also see in here I have formatting. So right now I have this kind of set up as a 2-column tab. If I wanted to, I could switch this to a 3-column tab, and then this would allow me to kind of self-adjust these individual widths of these columns as needed. So I could either manually adjust these items if I wanted to, or I could just go ahead and select one of the predefined options, and that would select and adjust those accordingly. Adding columns is usually not that big of a deal. Where you sometimes run into situations is if you switch it from like a 3-column tab to a 2-column tab or something like that, then what happens is if you have sections that were on the form, those sections will actually be removed and that data will be removed. So it's always easy to add additional columns to a tab or to a section. Sometimes removing will allow some stuff to be taken off of the form, but you can always kind of adjust things as necessary. Now, the other thing to remember with this is the Dynamics 365 forms use what's called a responsive design. So what that basically means is they'll kind of self-correct and self-adjust based upon what type of screen resolution you're using and how people are looking through those. So even though this might be a 3-column tab section at this point, when I actually display it in the browser, if I don't have the window maximized or something like that, it will self-adjust. And so that's nice because you don't necessarily have to take that into account as you're building in and working through these individual forms. Now, at some point, you're going to want to go in and start inserting different types of controls and items into this. So if I click over here on Insert, this is where I can now start inserting different elements into this form. So I can see in here that I have my sections. So if I wanted to add maybe another 1-column section or 2-column section, I could do that. This is where if I wanted to bring a new tab into the form, I could add a 1-column tab. This is also where if I wanted to bring in things like web resources and iframes and some of those items, I could also bring some of those items in as necessary. We'll talk a little bit more about those as we move forward. But let's just go ahead and just create kind of a generalized situation here. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to just go in and I'm going to say that I want to add a section in here called address. So I'm going to click on the general section and underneath it I'm going to add a 1-column section that's going to come into my form. I'm going to go ahead and make sure that this section is kind of highlighted blue, and I could do one of two things here. I could either hit change properties or I could just double click on the section and this would open it up from a properties perspective. And maybe in here I'm just going to call this address info. And I'm going to show the label on the form. Maybe I'm going to add a line. And then I'm going to keep everything kind of visible by default. And if I wanted to, I could also adjust kind of how things are aligned on this. I could adjust field position. This is where if I wanted to change kind of the overall look for how information is going to be presented inside this section, I could do that. But for today's purposes, I'll just go ahead and leave it as this. Now I'm going to drag address 1, and as I drag address 1 over, you'll see that I have kind of a red line. I'm just going to position this where I want this to be located on the form. Now, because this is also the active object on the form itself, I could, if I wanted to, just double click on it, and then it would also just move it over right underneath the last item that I selected. So you could do either one. You could drag and drop the information in here based upon how you want to do it, or you could kind of double click that information as necessary. Now, in this case, I'm going to go ahead and add just a couple other situations here. So I'm going to add loan amount to this. And we'll add applicant to this, application date, approval needed, and that looks good for now. Now, I'm going to do one more kind of quick little thing in this scenario. So now I'm going to add just one more section. So I'm going to click on this address area, go to insert, insert another 1-column section underneath it. I'm going to double click on it. I'm going to call this loan description. And I'm just going to take the description field and move that over into here. So now it's just a matter of you kind of positioning information on this form the way that you want. So now in this case, maybe what I would do is I don't probably need the owner field since I already have it up in the header. So I can click on the owner field and I could do one of two things. I could either just hit remove here if I wanted to, or I could just hit my delete key and that would physically remove it. Now, because I already have owner somewhere else on the form, it does let me remove that. If I try to remove a required field and I don't have it somewhere else on the form, it'll tell me that I can't remove it because it is a required field in the application. So this is where I could just kind of adjust this information as needed and then kind of, position things as I needed to accordingly. So I'll go ahead and in this situation, we'll put applicant phone. And now as I'm ready to go, if I realize I make a mistake or something like that, the form designer itself does have an undo and redo option, so I would have the capabilities to kind of undo and redo this information as necessary. Once I'm ready and I feel like I have kind of everything in place, now I could go ahead and hit save. That'll save this form. And then once I'm ready for this to actually be pushed out so everybody else could see it inside my organization, the other option I could do was publish this. But before I do that, I'm going to just take this loan description section and I'm going to move it over here and I'm going to save one more time and now I'm going to publish it. Once your customizations are published, now it's something that I basically could go out and use inside the application. So now if I were to go back into Dynamics 365 and I go into Sales and I scroll over, here is that loan applications that I've worked with or that custom entity. When I click on this loan applications, it'll go ahead and open up the loan applications view. Now at this point I won't really see any loan applications because I don't have any, and you'll notice that it's a pretty generic view. We'll talk about how to adjust this here in a later module. But if I now want to create a new loan application, I can click on loan application and it will now go out and allow me to work through the form. So here I can see the description, here I can see the loan amount, the applicant, all of my individual items that I want to work with. So we'll call this sample loan. Loan amount is going to be $15,000. Applicant, I can click on the applicant, and now if I scroll down in here and I go to look up more records, this is where, because I associated it with the customer item earlier, this is where I can either choose the account or the contact based upon who's applying for this loan. At this point, we'll go ahead and just choose Fourth Coffee and add. And then you'll notice that the social security number, this is that secured field that we added earlier when we were talking about different secured fields. In this case, we'll go ahead and just leave it alone for now. This is a calculated field, so this would actually pull in from an account if I were to create a new loan for an account. So I can't necessarily edit into this, but this would be displayed if I had information from there. And then I could just come in here and based upon those individual situations, I could define when I applied for this and then work with information from there. And finally, we'll put in our last little pieces of address information. Now, you'll notice that with loan description, I don't necessarily have a ton of room here. So this might be a scenario where I may want to go back at some point and maybe just kind of adjust this. So there's actually a couple of different ways I could do that. One of the ways is just by clicking on Form Editor. This will open up the Form Editor and then allow me to actually go in and edit it from that standpoint. The other option would be to physically just kind of save and close the record, go back into the designer, and then make the necessary adjustments based upon those. So now I could go back into my solution, I could open up this main form, I could go into my loan description, kind of open up this information, decide, you know what, maybe I don't want to have the label displayed on the form. Maybe I'm going to go into my formatting, and in my formatting, I'm going to make this like 10 rows, adjust it from here. Now it's made it a little bit bigger. Now this might be a little bigger than I actually need it, but that's okay. Now I'll go ahead and publish it. And then once it's done, I could go back into my loan applications, open up this sample loan, and then I would actually see now the expanded area of space, and now I could just type information in here, but now I have a little bit more room to work with. And then I can also see up here on the header that I have the loan type associated with this as well. So this is just a real kind of quick overview on how you can start designing and laying out these individual forms based upon what you would need. Depending upon what your specific needs are, there's some additional form components that you can add directly onto a form to provide more like along the lines of more enhanced functionality. For example, you saw kind of when we were doing the demo a little bit earlier, there was that concept of that notes control where I could add notes directly to the form, or I could actually go in and that actually has another element in there that allows me to work with activities. But let's say, for example, maybe I wanted to bring in a Bing map so I could actually see where they were located based upon their address. These are the types of things that we can bring in based upon different items or scenarios as part of the form. The other thing would be maybe if you wanted to have an external web application displayed inside a CRM form, you could use things like web resources and iframes to be able to kind of facilitate that. Now, generally speaking, you may need to do a little bit of development to get those configured to work properly, but they are at the very least components that you can bring into the form based upon those items. And so you see here just kind of a generalized list of some of the components that would be available. Some of these are going to depend a little bit based upon the additional functionality that you've actually enabled for the entity. But for example, one of the key ones that you would see here would be the notes control. So the notes control is going to allow you to see kind of system posts that would be automatically fed in from Microsoft Dynamics CRM, from Dynamics 365. You also would see things like activities. So if I have phone calls, if I have tasks, if I have meetings that are associated with this particular record inside the application, I could navigate to these items. I could expand and work with information from there. The nice thing about this is all of this information can be kind of edited in line directly from within this control. Now, this is typically a control that gets added automatically when you create kind of a new entity or a new item, and it can only be added to a form once. So oftentimes you might see that this control is grayed out. Typically that's because it's already been added to the form and you don't necessarily have the ability to add it more than once. But as I mentioned, you might do things like external resources. So web resources are a great way that if you wanted to add a custom HTML page or use JavaScript files for client-side scripting, these are things that you could link to as part of external web resources. Maybe you would have situations like an iframe. I mentioned that you want to have an external web page be displayed inside the application. What's nice about this is you can assign just a generalized URL to it, and then you also have the capabilities to kind of dynamically populate that URL based upon things like JavaScript and different elements that might be added to the form. But you would also be able to do things like Bing Maps. This is where if you have things that are using what's called the true composite address record, this is also would allow you, if you have a Bing Maps kind of on-premise subscription, you would be able to use that as long as you have kind of your own API key to be able to interact with that. But these are just some of the items that you could work with. Spacers, one of the things that you'll notice on the forms themselves is you don't necessarily have the capabilities to just position things dynamically where you want to go. So if you need to have a blank space in there for some reason, spacers are a great way to kind of facilitate that inside the application. If you're using service level agreements or SLAs and you have custom KPIs associated with this entity, you can add the timer control to be able to facilitate that. Same things with knowledge base searches if you wanted to be able to search the knowledge base from this particular form, or even do things like social insights if you have a link tied together with Microsoft Dynamics social engagement. So these are just things that really allow you to now expand the functionality of what this specific form is able to do inside the application. Another option that you have is to do what are called subgrids. So within the record itself, we saw when we were talking about kind of the form structure and the related records that through record navigation, I could go up and if I had any, related records like contacts associated with an account or something like that, I could go in and I could add those and navigate to those directly through the form. But sometimes it's nice just to have that information displayed as a subgrid. And so subgrids are something that you're probably going to add more often than not to most forms that you're working with, just because it makes the form much easier for individuals to use as they're consuming it as part of the application. Now, from a subgrid perspective, usually when you add a subgrid, you are displaying related records. So for example, I want to see all the contacts associated with an account. You don't necessarily always have to do related records. There are certain instances where you might not do that, but in most cases, you're probably going to do related records. Now, the big thing to remember is if you're going to do related records, there has to be a relationship between the item that you're working with and the entity that you're using as part of the subgrid. But what's nice about these subgrids is now you have the capabilities to go in and access that information and edit that information directly from within the form itself. So what you can see over here on the side is kind of the configuration that we use to set it up. So when you add the subgrid, you specify the entity that you want to work with. You specify if you want to work with related records or non-related records, and then you specify kind of what view you want to use inside the application. And then once that form has been published, this is what that subgrid is going to look like inside the app. It's going to show you basically the people or the item that you have listed based upon the view that you've chosen. And then from here, I would have the capabilities to navigate to this list directly, or by clicking the little plus sign, I can actually add new records directly in here as well. Now, historically, when you've worked with subgrids inside a Dynamics 365 form, you really didn't have the capabilities to do anything from an editing perspective. That's one of the cool things now with Dynamics 365 is we can do what are called editable grids. And so if I were to come in and look on kind of this next slide, one of the things that I can do is for that subgrid, there's actually a controls option where I can go in and add editable grid functionality. And now what that actually allows me to do is once I'm in that record, I can now come in and I can click on specific fields or items within that record, and I could edit those directly inside the form. And this just now gives you much more flexibility, so you don't have to consistently navigate and click through different elements on the form to work through that. So I want to add a subgrid to this loan application form. So I'm going to, again, back in my application, back in my loan management solution, I'm going to open up this loan application form again, and I'm going to maximize it so it fills up kind of my entire screen. Now, I'm going to, real quick before I add this subgrid, I'm actually going to come in here to loan description, and I'm going to make this just a little bit smaller just for space purposes. So maybe I'll pop this down to like 4 rows. And now I'm going to go ahead and with this kind of section selected, I'm going to go up into Insert, and I'm going to see an option here for Subgrid. And so when I insert the subgrid, now I'm going to determine how I want this to be attached. So for example, maybe with loan applications, maybe you have people that are co-applicants or co-signers that sometimes come into this. So I want a subgrid where I can basically add some of these co-applicants directly onto this form, maybe from existing contacts or other records in the application. So I'm going to just call this co-applicant. I'm going to come down into here where it says data source, and I'm going to click on my down arrow, and this is going to show me all the records or relationships that we have associated with this. So in this case, I'm going to choose contacts for co-applicants because I have a relationship between contacts and loan applications. When I click on that, I can see that the label automatically changes based upon that scenario. So I usually tell people it's always best to go down and kind of define the data source first so I can see what that looks like inside here. Now I could come into here. I'm going to call this co-applicants. If I wanted to, I could show only related records in this situation, which I would want to do. I'd only want to see co-applicants associated with this loan application. And then I can pick what view I want to use. So this is where any view in the system that I want to work with, I can define. If I choose my active contacts, this is only going to show me contacts that are associated with this loan application that I own. So I might switch this to active just to bring kind of everything in. And then if I wanted to, I could determine whether or not I want them to be able to switch views within this, whether or not I wanted to have a chart shown in this scenario, and whether or not I wanted to have a search box and additional items. For right now, we'll just go ahead and click on OK. So now my co-applicants option is showing up in here. I'm going to go ahead and on the section itself, we'll leave it like that. That looks perfect. I'm going to go ahead and save and publish. And now go back into my loan application, reopen it up. There's my subgrid. I could have added a label to this if I wanted to, but here's where I could add those co-applicants. Now I could come in here, I could click on Add Contact. This will give me a lookup field. I can now determine which particular contact I want to associate this with. In this case, we'll just choose Jim Glynn. And now Jim is added as a co-applicant onto this particular loan application. Now you'll see that I can't do a ton here. I mean, I can see it and I can do stuff with it, but I can't necessarily edit a bunch of stuff. So that's where this editable subgrid comes into play. So I'm going to go ahead and just very quickly go back into my customization area, back into the form, and I'm going to open up this co-applicant subgrid. And here's where I have controls. So this is where I can basically turn this from a static grid into an editable grid inside the application. So now I'm going to go ahead and choose Add Control. I'm going to choose Editable Grid, and then I'll hit Add. So this will be an editable grid that will be displayed in the application. So now in here, it shows me kind of what grid view it's using, because it's the grid view based upon the actual view that I had selected. If I wanted to, this is where I could go in and I could add lookups to other configurations. So I could basically go in and see what specific view I'm using on this. And if I had lookups to other columns or other entities based upon other items that we'd kind of defined, I could work through that. If I wanted to nest stuff in here, I could. And then this also gives me grouping capabilities. So if I wanted to group this information, I could group this. So you would just want to play with these a little bit based upon your specific needs. But we'll leave it pretty simplistic for today's purposes. And we'll define where I want this to be displayed inside the application. So I want to use editable grids anytime I'm on the web app. I want to use them anytime maybe I'm on the tablet app. And I'm not going to worry about them on the phone app. So for the phone, I'm just going to use standard read-only grids. That's one of the really cool things about these new kind of editable grid situations is you define what presentation area you want them to actually display on. Now the other thing is I might want to go in just for space purposes here, and maybe we'll just make this like 8 rows just so it's a little bit bigger, and then we'll go ahead and click on OK. Now I'm going to go ahead and save this form one last time. And let's do one more thing. Let's go into co-applicants and let's display the label on the form. Yeah, we don't need to worry about that. We will publish it. And now if I go back into this loan application, now I can see that I have a little bit different kind of layout on this scenario. I can see that I have Jim Glynn. If I click into his email address, now I can actually edit his email address if I wanted to. And then once I'm done making those changes, I could hit save over here and it would save it. Now again, this is where you do want to play with positioning and those types of things on the form. But this is where now if you want to have just some generalized editing capabilities added to this form, you could define those very quickly and work with it from there. Now not only does this editable grid concept work inside the entity itself, but if you enable it for an entity when you create it as well, then you would also be able to click inside a specific option here and then use editable grids from that standpoint. But again, this was when we first created the entity, we would have had to specify editable grids from that standpoint to be able to show them. But this adds a whole new dimension to kind of your Dynamics 365 experience. And I would definitely recommend playing with editable grids and playing with some of the grouping options around there to really find the best mix for what's going to work for you based upon what it is that you're trying to accomplish. Another really nice use case for subgrids is this as a concept called access teams. And so when you think about access teams, think about them in the context of being able to share records kind of on the fly simply by adding people to a subgrid on a form. So what's kind of neat about these access teams is you're going to define what specific permissions to a record somebody should have based upon whether or not they're added to a subgrid. And once they're added to that subgrid on that form, they're automatically added to what's called an access team. And then they automatically have the rights that are kind of defined from that standpoint. So there's a few different elements that kind of are at work here. There's a concept of what are called enabling an entity for access teams, making sure that you turn that on for a specific entity. There's a concept of what are called access team templates, and the access team templates define what specific permissions people will have when they're added to that access team. And then there's the actual subgrid on the form that allows you to kind of create those. So what you end up doing is you create what's called an access team template that says, okay, anybody who's added to this access team will have these permissions to this record. So they can edit it, they can share it, they can assign it. You basically kind of define what those items are. Now these teams don't actually get created until the first user is added to that access team. So once I'm on that record and I add somebody to that access team, now the team is going to get created and that record is going to get shared with the actual access team. So anybody who now becomes a member of that access team will have access to that record. And it's very easy because to add and remove users from those views because they're a part of a subgrid. And because it's a team and because it uses the team record inside CRM, it also can use queries to determine who is actually has the access to this record and those kind of things. So one of the things that you have to do is you have to define who are going to be team members, and that's done by adding people to that subgrid. Now, a couple of things you need to remember when you're creating and working with access team members. When a user is added to the access team, the user who adds the new team member to the record has to have share privileges on the record. So on their security roles, if you think back to the configuration course, if I am going to add somebody to an access team or to that subgrid, I have to have the ability to share that record out inside Dynamics 365. So if I don't, I cannot add users to that access team. The other thing is when I'm adding somebody to that access team, so whoever's adding that team member, I must have for this record all of the access rights that are defined in that template. So for example, if the access team template is saying, okay, I'm going to give people the ability to edit this record and delete this record. If I don't also have the ability to edit and delete this record, I cannot add people to that access team. So it's that concept of not being able to give somebody more rights to something than what you have. So you have to make sure that you have all of the permissions that are defined in that access team template before you start adding members to it. And then the other thing is when the user who is added to the actual access team has to have user level access to all privileges that the access team template has. So for example, if the access team template says that you're going to be able to edit and delete this record, if I don't at least have the ability to edit and delete my own records of that same type, I cannot be added to an access team that's going to give me permissions to that to do so in that record. And I'll explain that a little bit more inside the demo. But basically, I cannot have more permissions to somebody else's records than I would have just to generalized records inside the application itself. So what you have to do to turn kind of this functionality on is you first have to go in and enable the entity for access teams. And then once you've enabled the entity for access teams, then you have to go in and create an access team template that's going to define all the specific rights that the members will be granted when they're added to that access team. And then you basically, for that form, basically go in, add a subgrid that uses that access team as the record permissions. And that's what we'll go ahead and show you how to do inside a demo. So again, now that I'm back in my loan management solution, I've gone into my loan application entity and I've clicked on my loan application entity to bring up the entity properties. And so once I have the entity properties shown, I can scroll down and one of the options I'll see under communication and collaboration is access teams. So in order for me to use access teams for this entity, I do have to go in and physically define the access team option. So in here, I'm going to go ahead and click on access teams. And then I'm going to go ahead and save. And then I can even just publish just to be safe. But we'll go ahead and save and publish this here real quick. Now, as this is publishing, I'll just go back into the application. Access team templates are technically a configuration option that you can do. So if I were to go back into Dynamics 365 and I were to go into Settings, I will see an option here under Security. And one of the options I'll see under Security down towards the bottom is Access Team Templates. This is where I have to go in and kind of define the Access Team templates for the entities I want to work with. So when I click on Access Team Templates, this is going to open up all the active Access Team templates that we have. And currently right now there's only one associated with the Opportunity entity. I'm going to go ahead and click on New. I'm going to call this just a team. We'll just call this read write. Now I pick my entity, and because loan application has now been enabled for access teams, I'm going to go ahead and choose loan application. I'm going to define what specific permissions members of this group or team should have. They should have read and they should have write privileges to this record. So now if I go ahead and save and close this access team template, now I can go back into my solution, and in my solution I can go to Forms, and I'm going to go back into my main form, and I'm going to real quick from a real estate standpoint, I'm going to open up my option here for my co-applicants. I'm going to switch all this back to web, to non-editable grids, and I'm going to change my formatting back down to like 4 just for space. Okay, so now I'm going to go in here and I'm going to go to Insert, and I'm going to just basically insert another subgrid. So I'll insert a subgrid. I'm going to call this Team Members. I'm going to come down into my entity, and now in this case I'm actually going to switch this from only related records to all record types, because I'm going to associate this with Dynamics 365 users. So not all of these users are necessarily going to have this record shared with them by default. So I'm going to switch the entity now if I come down to users, because I want to be able to add Dynamics 365 users. Then when I see my default view, I'm going to switch this from enabled users to associated record team members. And this is basically what enables this functionality for the access teams. Now in this case, you'll see that the team template now gets added, which is the access team template that we've defined earlier. So I'm going to call this label team members and display the label on the form. Go ahead and click on OK. And now if I save and publish, now I could go back into sales and loan applications, open up my loan application, and now from in here, here's where I have my team members. I can hit add here, browse out, find a specific team member that I want to work with. And as soon as I add that team member, now that person has all of the permissions that were defined in that access team template. So this is a great way from a sharing perspective and a collaboration perspective that you can kind of bring everybody together and then kind of work with the information from there. As you're designing these forms and laying everything out, one of the key things you always probably want to do before you publish it is just test it. Make sure that it's going to work the way it's intended. Make sure that all of your business rules are working. Make sure that everything's kind of laid out the way that you want it to be laid out within the application, and that really there isn't going to be any real surprises when somebody actually goes ahead and opens this up, whether it's in the web application or whether it's using the mobile application. When you go in, there's actually a preview button on the form itself, and when you go in there, there's actually an option to preview the form. And when you choose to preview, you can preview in one of two modes. You can preview it through the desktop client or through the web application, and you can look at the form either in a create version, update, or read only, or you can preview it on the mobile application. And the mobile application will actually preview it and give you the option to preview it through either a tablet or the phone client. Now, a couple things to remember when you're working with tablet and phone previews is it does actually use data inside CRM to preview that information. So you do have to have at least one record created for that entity type that you're working with in order for the preview to work through. It's completely read only. You can't go in and actually make changes, but you at least have data in there to see how it's going to be presented. The other thing to remember is the way that the tablet and the phone preview works, it actually takes a little bit more time to load that information in. So you may not necessarily see it loaded right away. You may have to wait a few minutes to get it loaded into the application, but it will definitely load in so you can work with it from there. So on the form itself, if I go up into preview, this is where I can decide kind of how I want these items to be previewed. So this is where I can decide if I want to preview it for the desktop client or if I wanted to preview it for the phone and mobile client. Now you'll notice here that I only have desktop client as an option, and that's because we have not enabled this entity for mobile. When we get into the mobile application and we start talking about customizing for mobile, we'll talk more about the mobile option and that presentation method. But for now, you can see that I've got desktop client. I can look at it if somebody were creating a new record, updating an existing record, or if they just had read-only privileges. So I could come into here, into my create form. It would then open it up kind of in a preview mode, and then I would see exactly what this would look like if somebody was going to go ahead and create this record from scratch inside the application. But the nice thing is this just now gives you the capabilities to really go in and kind of work through things and kind of see what things are going to look like before you actually publish and push the information out into the application. But again, once we get into some of the other scenarios, we'll show you specifically what that's going to look like once you preview that information from there. So now you can see in here that this is what my form is going to look like. It's laid out a little bit different, and part of that is that responsive form design. If I were to maximize this, now I'm going to get it more in line with what I would be expecting from a form application inside there. So this is where you can also experiment with kind of that responsive design and see what things are going to look like based upon what people are doing. As we mentioned kind of at the top of the module, there's more than just the main form views that you have available with Dynamics 365. There's two additional form options that you can work with. The first one is the Quick Create form. And the Quick Create form is really only designed to allow you to go out and very quickly capture some generic information about what it is that you're trying to work with, so you can come back later and then add additional details as needed by opening up the main form. This is really more in the context of maybe I'm going to be creating a record, through a subgrid, or I very quickly want to just create a record inside the application. Now, the big thing to remember with Quick Create forms is they're only one tab form. So that concept of being able to use additional tabs and different items within those scenarios, we don't have that capabilities with Quick Create forms. Quick Create forms, you're going to get one tab and one tab only. You're also going to get 3 columns, and you're also going to be able to have one section in each column. So it's a one form with a 3-column tab with one section in each column. You do not have the ability to add anything like Bing Maps, iframes, web resources, any of that stuff. The only real options that you can do is fields and spacers. Now, if you have business rules associated with this entity, which we'll talk about in the next module, those do apply and transfer over to Quick Create. But realistically, what you would be looking at from a Quick Create perspective, I just have very generic information. I don't want to do anything fancy. I just want to capture a couple of pieces of information and move on from there. And so that's really what you would see from a Quick Create standpoint. The big thing to remember with Quick Create is the entity has to be enabled for Quick Create before you can actually work with it. And that's why you saw when we went into the additional items for the loan application earlier, we didn't see Quick Create because we had not yet enabled it for that entity. Once you've enabled it, now if you go into kind of the global create button on the navigation bar, or if you use a subgrid to create a record of that type, it'll use the Quick Create form. And we'll show you this here in a demo in just a couple of seconds. The other option that you have is what's called a Quick View form. And so this is a little bit different. This is working within the context of a parent record. So for example, like I might have an account that's associated with a loan application. That account will have a parent account. That parent account, when I show it on the form, typically I can just click on the link and open it up. What these quick views allow us to do is to take details from the parent record and actually display them on the form. So I could see things like the address and the phone number and things that would be very relevant to something that I want to work with as part of the application. The other thing that's nice about these quick view forms is I do have the capabilities to actually go in and add things like subgrids and fields and spacers. And so this is where I can now start adding additional elements into that to really make the information work through and display. Now everything inside the quick view form is actually going to be read-only, but it at least gives you access to that information where you can click on it, open it up, and then kind of define the information that you want to work with. And so the next thing I want to do is just take you in and do a little bit with quick views and quick create so you can see exactly how that transfers over into the app. So let's look at this kind of from a two-tier perspective. We're going to go ahead and pop in and talk a little bit about the quick view forms and the quick create forms. So if I go back into my solution and I go into loan application, one of the first things that you'll see under loan application is underneath the communication and collaboration, there is, if I go down, there's an option here for allow quick create. And so this is the first thing that I have to kind of turn on under data services is allow quick create. Without that, I will not have the ability to work with it. So in here, I'm going to hit save. And once I save that entity after allowing for quick create, now if I can come over here to forms, I will have an option here to add a quick create form. And so when I go into this quick create form, this is where I can define exactly what I want to show up in here. And as you can see, it's very simplistic. I have my tabs and I have my sections. So in this case, I'm going to go ahead and in this first section, I'm going to call this maybe just general info. And I'll show the label. And then I will add the name. I will add the loan amount. And I will add the loan type. And then maybe and then we'll go from there. Now the next thing I'm going to do is go into the next section. I'm going to call this maybe applicant info. And show that label on the form. And I'm going to add the applicant and the application date and the applicant's social security number. And then I will finally go over to kind of the final area here, and I will go over and double click on this one. I am going to call this address and show the label on the form. And then I'll just drag address 1, city, state, and zip. So just very simplistic. Now I'm going to go ahead and save and close this. Now, before we publish this and work it out, let's switch over to the account entity real quick. So I'm going to go over to the account entity, and I'm going to go over to forms on the account entity. And on the account entity, I can see that I have a quick view form here for the account card or the account reference panel. So in this case is where I could actually go in and determine additional items or items that I would want to show for this particular account record. So I'm going to go ahead and just open up this recent cases and entitlements option here. Actually, let's do account reference panel. This is an example of a quick view form. So as you can see for the account reference panel, it's got the name, annual revenue, number of employees, primary contact, email address, some of those baseline information. This would be what would ultimately be displayed on another entity form. Let's open up another one. So I've got my related cases and entitlements. If I open this one up, I can see that in here I have the recent cases associated with this as well as the entitlements. If I wanted to, I could come into here and I could add additional fields to this. So I could come in and add maybe the account name. Maybe I'm going to add the account number. And then maybe I will add the email address. Now, if I save and close this, or save this and then publish this, now what I could do is I could go back into my loan application forms, and on my loan application form, I could add that account quick view form. So now I could come into here and maybe I want to have some of that generalized information being displayed. So I could maybe come over here into this section. I could go into insert. I could insert a quick view form, and it's going to ask me what is the quick view form I want to look at. Well, I want to look at the account. I want to use the lookup field applicant, and the quick view form I want to use is that cases and entitlements. I'm going to call this account details. And now I'll go ahead and click on OK. Now I'm going to move this up a little bit more so you can kind of see it underneath loan description. Now this will take up a little bit more real estate in the actual form itself than what you see here, but it's nice for illustration purposes. So now I'm going to go ahead and go home, save. Actually, let's go save and close. Now I'm going to go ahead and just for ease purposes, I'm going to publish all customizations. And once this is done publishing, now I'm going to go back into my actual application, back into loan applications, open up this sample loan application. And now here's that account details information. So I can see the account name, I can see the recent cases, I can see the entitlements. These are all things that I can kind of define based upon those situations. Now I might need to play with the view positioning a little bit, but this is where I can see that account card information displayed inside this form. And so this just added in based upon those individual items. Now the other thing that I can do is if I go up into the application and I click on New, one of the options that I will have is the ability to add a new record. So in this case, let's go back to just Dynamics 365 as a whole here. Let me refresh this real quick. Sometimes when you push out things that are going to be navigational type changes, sometimes those do not actually push out until you refresh. But once you refresh, then you can come out into here, and as you click on the option, it'll see loan application as a quick create, and here is that quick create form for the loan application that we've designed. So here's the general applicant info, address info. Either way, however you want to use quick create or quick view, these just add another dimension to make it much easier for people to interact with the application as they're moving through. The final consideration that you want to sometimes think about when it comes into forms is, do you need more than one? And as you could see just through some of the baseline customizations that we're doing, if you were trying to build a form that was going to be accessible and accommodate every single user that you were going to work with inside Dynamics 365, you would oftentimes run into a situation where you might have a huge form that's just really hard for you to navigate through. So one of the things that you can do inside the application is you can enable specific forms for specific security roles. And by going in and doing that, when you enable a form for a specific security role, now only users who have that security role inside the system would actually see that form. And what's nice about that is now you could have a situation where somebody has just this form available, and now you have more targeted forms based upon who they are within the application. And what's nice about that is once you've done that, now you could go in and you could, deactivate a form, or you could remove specific security roles for individual people to allow only certain people to work within the context of that form. Now, what ends up happening is it uses this concept of what's called form order, and this form order determines what form the user is going to receive. So it looks at what specific security role that user has and what security roles are associated with that form, and then it looks at where it sits in the hierarchy, and that's the form that's ultimately going to get delivered to the user once they go into the application. Now, once they've gone in and they've opened up a form, it kind of defaults back to that one while they're still inside the application, but you will only see the forms that you as a user have access to when you're working through it. And that's the next thing that we want to show you here real quick, is just what that looks like. So again, with me back in my loan application or my loan management solution, I'm back in my forms for my loan application. I'm going to just go ahead real quick and I'm going to open up this kind of main form that I've been working with to this point. And I'm going to do a save as on this. So I'm going to just do a quick save as, and I'm going to call this sample role form. So I save this as sample, kind of a role-based form. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to make just some very generic customizations to this. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to remove this account details quick view. I'm going to remove co-applicants, team members, also going to remove address info. Now I'm going to go ahead and save this form. And then up here, I will see an Enable Security Roles. When I click on Enable Security Roles, this is where I can define what specific security roles inside the application that this form is going to be used for. So in this case, I'm going to leave it just at System Administrator and System Customizer, but realistically, you would do this for any security roles that you want. I'm going to go ahead and click on OK. Then I'll go ahead and save and close. Now, if I look inside here, I see my sample role form and my informational form, but I also see form order. And so if I go to form order, I go to my main form set because they're both main forms. This is where I can define which form is going to contain higher order from within the application. So in this case, sample role is going to be first. So anybody who has this form associated with their security role, or has the security role associated with this form, this is what they're going to deliver. So this is where I could just kind of move these up and down as needed. Now in this case, I'm going to just go ahead and click on OK, publish all customizations. And then once my customizations are published, if I go back into sales and loan applications, and open up this sample loan application. Now I'm system administrator and I've already kind of been working through these records a little bit, so mine's going to look a little bit different, but you can see that it automatically opened up into my sample role form. So here I can see that I only have the general section and the loan description. Because I have multiple forms associated with my security role, I could now click on this, I could switch this to information, and I could get the different version of this form for other items. Realistically, if I was working with this in a real world type situation, as a user, I might only have one of these forms available to me, which is ultimately the one that I'm going to see. But this is a great way that you can now start to create very different versions of forms for different subsets of users inside your organization, and then deliver just specific use cases to those users moving forward. Before you go in and you actually start creating forms in Dynamics 365, you really want to take some time and meet with the people who are actually going to be consuming those forms and just talk to them about what is going to be needed on that form to allow them to do their job most effectively. You want to evaluate whether or not you're going to need to use, multiple forms based upon their user roles within the organization, but you also want to consider if users will access these from different client versions like mobile and tablet. And we'll talk a little bit about that as we get into different areas and different aspects of the application. But what's important to remember is Dynamics 365 does give you several different items that can be included on that form to really tailor it to the way that those users are going to experience and work with it. Each component added to a form will have many different properties that you can use to modify how it interacts. And you saw that a little bit with some of the different iframes, and you even saw that with some of the different tabs and sections that we worked with. And I think that's really important to note is just adding those components to that form isn't necessarily going to be the be-all end-all. You do have to take some time to decide how you want to configure those information when you're moving forward. And then the other thing to remember is depending upon what you want to work with from related data, it's definitely nice to look at doing things like subgrids, because those subgrids on those forms are going to make it much easier for you to actually go in and view that related data. But that's also going to be the area where you can go in and start doing things like access teams and editable grids and really start to create kind of this dynamic experience for your users as they're working through and consuming those forms.